The cameras caught it, the silence before the applause. At a glittering state banquet beside President Macron, King Charles leaned toward Princess Catherine and declared what no one expected. "She will succeed me." What followed sent tremors through royal halls and left Camilla reeling. It began like any other grand affair at Buckingham Palace: polished silver, velvet drapery, and crystal chandeliers illuminating the tables. Global press lined the marble halls, but none expected the firestorm to ignite that night. President Emmanuel Macron sat to Charles's left, sharing whispered exchanges about diplomacy, trade, and unity. But to the king's right, in a position that defied tradition, sat Princess Catherine, calm, composed, and radiant in the heavy silence of expectation. This was no accident. The Queen Consort, Camilla, was seated 3 chairs down, noticeably distant, both physically and emotionally. Royal watchers took note, but said nothing. Yet, the banquet moved forward in routine splendor until the toast, an act usually laced with predictable platitudes. But this time, Charles rose with a subtle tremor in his voice, his gaze fixed not on Macron, but on Catherine. The room, buzzing moments before, fell eerily silent. Glasses were raised, but remained untouched. He spoke of legacy, continuity, and the future of a modern monarchy, words that had always lived in the abstract. Then, like a thunderclap in the middle of a hymn, he said, "She will succeed me." A single sentence, 6 words, and with them, a kingdom tilted. Gasps echoed like cannon fire across the dining hall. Macron blinked in disbelief. High-ranking officials turned to one another in stunned silence. And Camilla, eyes wide, lips trembling, sat frozen. Not a single flicker of expression crossed her face. But behind the eyes, something had shattered. The cameras didn't miss it. The press didn't either. By morning, her image stunned, pale, unmoving was already splashed across front pages worldwide. "The Queen who watched it slip away," one headline read. But what led to this daring moment? To understand, we must rewind to what happened just days before behind palace doors. While the world saw Catherine as the smiling future Queen Consort, poised, polished, and seemingly content in her ceremonial role, something deeper, far more consequential, had been unfolding behind the palace walls. This wasn't about waving from balconies or unveiling hospital plaques. It was about the soul of the monarchy, and Catherine was quietly stepping into its core. While the cameras were focused on her gowns, her composure, and her grace under pressure, few realized she had been summoned again and again to the king's private study, not for pleasantries, but for strategy. In hushed tones and dimly lit rooms, Catherine began receiving private briefings usually reserved for the sovereign. One after another, foreign policy dossiers, economic intelligence memos, and diplomatic communiques were placed in front of her. Advisors who had once dismissed her as merely a supportive spouse now sat across from her with grave expressions, offering insights that spoke of crisis, alliances, and power. But it wasn't only Charles orchestrating this shift. Princess Anne, ever the sentinel of tradition and loyalty, began guiding Catherine deeper into royal history. Their secret visits to the Windsor archives were not casual strolls through memory. They were lessons, tests, rehearsals. And it was there, in the solitude of crumbling parchment and locked cabinets, that a new Catherine began to emerge, not born into power, but now sculpted by it. Then came the moment that changed everything. Anne handed her a folder, jet black, sealed with the Queen's crest. No words, no explanations, just a nod. What lay inside would remain a secret even from William for days. But that night, something in her shifted. Her gaze steadied. Her shoulders squared. And when she finally showed William the contents, his breath caught. "You're ready," he whispered, not with pride, but with quiet fear. Because readiness, in this family, meant war. The palace began to feel it too. Whispers in the corridors turned into murmurs at state meetings. The Queen's old advisors, many of whom had resisted Camilla's rise, began deferring to Catherine. Subtle things. A chair repositioned closer to Charles. An unscheduled inclusion in a defense briefing. A draft speech rewritten in her voice. Not his. She hadn't demanded any of it, but the power was drifting toward her like a tide that couldn't be stopped. And though she said little, her silence spoke volumes. It wasn't ambition that drove her, it was duty. And duty, unlike title, cannot be faked. But across the palace, not everyone was applauding this quiet revolution. Camilla, ever watchful, began to sense the shadows closing in. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. A missed invitation here. I skipped debriefing there. But then, the patterns became too frequent, too deliberate. Catherine was no longer walking behind. She was walking beside me. And that for Camilla was the first sign of betrayal. What Catherine had inherited in silence, Camilla felt slipping away in noise. And when those whispers reached her ear, they weren't gentle. Charles is preparing her for more than you think. And just like that, the game began. Not one of thrones and crowns, but of legacy, power, and quiet battles fought behind regal smiles. And as Catherine rose with composure, Camilla began to burn with questions and fury. She waited for this crown her entire life, and now it felt like it was slipping into the hands of the woman she once thought she could control. Camilla's fury couldn't be hidden any longer. The palace had always been Camilla's battlefield. Quiet corridors, whispered alliances, subtle gestures that carried the weight of power. She had clawed her way through scandal and decades of disgrace to reach the throne. And yet now, in the twilight of her triumph, she saw it crumbling not through scandal or scandalous headlines, but through the quiet, effortless rise of Catherine. It wasn't just public adoration anymore. It was structured, strategy, intention, and that terrified her. After a private dinner that was meant to calm tensions, Camilla cornered Charles. Her voice, low and trembling with anger, cut through the gilded calm. "What are you planning with her?" she hissed. Charles looked at her, his eyes heavy with something unreadable weariness, maybe even regret. But he didn't answer. That silence said more than any confession. It confirmed every suspicion she had buried beneath her fragile calm. The tension between them, once managed through diplomacy and distance, now exploded into a full confrontation that shattered their carefully crafted illusion of unity. What Camilla didn't know was that royal staff were just beyond the corridor, and the walls, thick as they were, couldn't muffle the storm. The next morning, whispers turned to reports. A leak reached the tabloids. "Camilla confronts Charles over Catherine's rise," screamed the headlines. The story spread like wildfire, but for Camilla, the betrayal ran deeper than the front page. It ran through her veins. She had weathered Diana's ghost, survived the public's loathing, and finally claimed her place beside the king. And now this? In a moment of desperation, Camilla struck where she thought Charles was weakest. "Diana's shadow is enough, now her too," she said, her voice breaking not from pain, but from fear. But Charles didn't flinch. His face tightened, the years of royal burden etched into his expression. That's when William walked in. And when he saw his stepmother's finger pointed, her voice trembling, his instincts didn't hesitate. He moved to Catherine's defense not with fury, but with presence. Silent, unshakable. It was enough. Camilla froze. For a second, even she saw it. The future standing in front of her, and it didn't include her. Charles, caught between the two forces that defined his past and future, offered no comfort, no reconciliation. Only one sentence. Cold. Final. "It's not about you anymore." The words dropped like stones. Camilla turned away, not in defeat but in disbelief. Because for the first time in her reign, she was irrelevant. But the final straw came from across the channel when Macron made a personal request that changed everything. It wasn't just ceremonial. Macron's visit, billed publicly as a diplomatic formality, was layered with silent tests, veiled intentions, and subtle plays of power. But what sent shockwaves through the palace was not the itinerary, it was the request. Quietly delivered through the French ambassador days before the banquet, the message was unmistakable. The president wished for a private audience with the Princess of Wales, not with King Charles, not with Queen Camilla, with Catherine. The meaning wasn't lost on anyone in the royal inner circle. In a world where titles mattered and protocol governed every breath, this wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. At first, the palace held its breath. Could they deny it? Should they? But Charles didn't hesitate. He gave a quiet nod, and just like that, the future was being placed into Catherine's hands with diplomatic precision. The Foreign Office mobilized. MI6 was discreetly involved. Cultural specialists briefed Catherine with surgical detail on everything from linguistic nuance to Macron's personal political alliances. It was a masterclass in modern monarchy, and she absorbed it not as a student, but as someone born to lead. This wasn't about pageantry, it was about presence, and Catherine understood that perfectly. But the most telling sign of change was who wasn't included. Camilla, once the king's closest confidant in all things ceremonial, was kept entirely out of the loop. No briefings, no background notes, not even a courtesy mention. She found out through palace whispers, and when she did, the silence that followed from Charles was deafening. No explanation, no apology, just omission. And in royal politics, omission is betrayal. Meanwhile, Macron's interest in Catherine wasn't impulsive. It was rooted in legacy. He had long admired Princess Diana, and to him, Catherine embodied that same rare blend of grace, influence, and emotional resonance. But more than that, she was untouched by scandal, unmarred by palace games. To Macron, she was not just a royal figure, she was a symbol of stability in a chaotic world. And that, in today's fractured geopolitical climate, carried more weight than any treaty. The private meeting was held in absolute secrecy. No aides, no press, just Catherine, her quiet confidence, and the leader of France. For over 45 minutes, they spoke in deliberate tones of history, diplomacy, and the quiet power of image. Macron was said to have leaned in, visibly impressed by her insight, her poise, her command of delicate topics. He had expected charm. What he received was strategy. And when they emerged, Macron's subtle smile said it all. The princess had passed his unspoken test, and in doing so, altered the perception of monarchy on an international stage. Charles, observing from a distance, saw it clearly. This was the moment he had waited for. A quiet coronation of capability. No crown, no fanfare, but a confirmation that the monarchy's future was already walking, talking, and leading in its next form. But Catherine, ever the dutiful figure, had no idea what was already in motion behind her. Because while she was securing diplomatic respect, Charles was preparing something far greater. Something that would make her role official not in whispers, not in shadows, but in full view of the world. Something public, undeniable, and irreversible. ChatGPT said, hidden deep within the king's private study, beneath decades-old manuscripts and confidential state papers, lay a single envelope. It bore the unmistakable weight of consequence, embossed with the royal crest, and sealed with wax bearing the monarch's own signet. Few knew of its existence. Even fewer understood its contents. But for those inside the inner sanctum of power, it was a weapon crafted not for war, but for succession. Inside was a decree that, once read aloud or revealed, would upend the centuries-old structure of royal protocol. And it bore one name only: Catherine. Weeks before the French state visit was even finalized, King Charles had already begun writing the document in secret, alongside his most trusted constitutional advisors. He was deliberate. This wasn't about abdication. It wasn't about crowning a successor. It was about preparing the monarchy to survive him, not just honor him. The wording was delicate, but unmistakably bold. It authorized the temporary transfer of ceremonial authority, allowing Catherine to act as his official representative in all non-legislative affairs during periods of transition or infirmity. Never before had such power been extended to someone outside the immediate heir apparent. Not even the Queen Consort had received such consideration. This was unprecedented and dangerously close to redefining monarchy itself. Before any ink touched parchment, Princess Anne was summoned to review it. The language was stark, clear, and binding. Anne, the most trusted royal operative, read it in silence. When she finally looked up, there was no hesitation in her voice. "She's ready," she said flatly, sealing her loyalty not just to Charles but to the future he had chosen. Her quiet nod was the final green light. On the morning of the banquet, the world outside bustled in diplomatic anticipation. But inside the palace, something heavier lingered in the air. In the hour before the guests arrived, Charles signed the document with a trembling hand, not out of doubt but the crushing weight of what it meant. This wasn't merely passing a baton, it was rewriting the monarchy's path while still wearing the crown. Once signed, the sealed decree was placed inside a leather folio, simple, unadorned, and unmistakably royal. Charles, without a word to anyone, slipped it beneath the seat assigned to Catherine at the state banquet. No ceremony, no announcement, only intent. It sat there as dignitaries dined, laughed, and raised toasts, an invisible force resting beneath her, waiting to collide with history. Catherine, unaware of the envelope's contents, felt the growing weight of her own rising role but had no idea how literal that weight had become. She had carried responsibility, but now she would carry the decree, a document that symbolically and legally aligned her with a destiny no one could reverse. And when the spotlight hit the banquet table, when the clinking of glasses faded into silence and Charles rose to speak, the world would finally see what had been set in motion behind the velvet curtains. One toast, one sentence, and the fate of the monarchy tilted forever. The room was dressed in formality, but beneath the glittering surface, something far greater stirred. This wasn't just another royal dinner. Not tonight. As Charles rose from his seat, champagne flute delicately raised, the buzz of polished conversation fell to a hush. Macron stood beside him, a diplomatic smile on his face. But even he sensed that this toast would carry more than political goodwill. Charles began as expected with graceful acknowledgments, time-honored praise for Franco-British ties, nods to shared values. But then, a pause, a breath. A pivot so subtle, and yet so seismic, it would ripple through the monarchy for generations. "I wish to recognize someone," he said, voice calm but layered with intent, "who embodies what this institution must become." His gaze turned, slowly but deliberately, until it landed on Catherine. She did not blink. Neither did anyone else. The room, once filled with cutlery and chatter, felt like it had stopped spinning. Charles's voice, quieter now, yet infinitely louder in meaning, carried the sentence that would shake the kingdom. "She will succeed me, in spirit, and perhaps someday, in duty." The impact was instant and irreversible. Macron turned toward Catherine with a glimmer of acknowledgement, not just as a royal figure, but as an emerging sovereign presence. He raised his glass to her, and at that moment, no title was needed. She had become more than a princess. She had become a symbol. Catherine's eyes welled, her grip on the stem of her glass tightening with emotion, not from vanity, but from the sheer weight of destiny suddenly made public. There was no applause yet, only awe, shock, and beneath it all, recognition that a declaration had been made not just to those present, but to the world. But not all were celebrating. Across the grand table, Camilla sat unmoving, her jaw set, her posture rigid, her fingers trembling ever so slightly around the glass she could no longer lift. She had heard every word. She had seen Charles's eyes bypass her. And in that single sentence, she had been erased not from title, but from legacy. As the room eventually stirred with soft applause, Camilla stood, whispering an excuse no one heard, and left the hall without turning back. Her exit, though quiet, roared louder than anything spoken that night. The Queen Consort had been dismissed, not formally, but functionally, and everyone knew it. What had once been speculation was now declared. Charles had made his intentions known, in front of heads of state, cameras, and Catherine herself. And yet, she hadn't asked for it. That's what made it all the more powerful. She was chosen not because she demanded to be, but because the future demanded her. But the banquet was only the beginning. What followed in the hours after would send the palace into unprecedented upheaval. Camilla stormed out straight into confrontation, and for once, Charles didn't shield her. The corridors of the palace echoed with tension long after the applause had faded. Camilla, usually the master of control and appearance, could no longer contain what had been boiling beneath her tightly managed exterior. She burst into her private quarters, slamming the door behind her, and in one violent, unrestrained motion, hurled a vase across the room. The shatter wasn't just ceramic, it was years of quiet manipulation, careful image building, and unspoken promises crumbling at her feet. Catherine had not only been chosen, she had been elevated, and Camilla had been cast aside without ceremony or consent. Moments later, Anne entered without knocking. Calm, firm, and unshaken. She stepped into the chaos like someone who had already accepted what Camilla was still fighting. "It was always going to be her, Camilla," she said, without cruelty, but with brutal honesty. Camilla whirled around, eyes wild with betrayal. "You knew! You and Charles! You conspired behind my back!" She spat, the words trembling more from fear than rage. But Anne didn't flinch. She had known this day would come, and she had made her peace with it long before the rest of them. Then Charles arrived, and for the first time in years, there was no warmth in his voice, no softness in his gaze. He looked at her not as a husband trying to soothe a storm, but as a monarch disappointed by the chaos that followed. Camilla demanded answers, demanded loyalty, demanded that he defend her. But Charles cut through her hysteria with one line that would leave scars far deeper than any tabloid headline: "I no longer trust your judgment." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. There was no room left for negotiation, no ground left to stand on. As the confrontation unfolded behind palace doors, a storm of a different kind brewed just beyond them. Footage somehow leaked from within and began to circulate. A grainy clip of Camilla in the hallway, red-eyed, visibly distressed, sobbing into her hands. The press descended like wolves. Headlines exploded across screens and newsstands. "Camilla melts down after King's declaration." Read one. Another, even more brutal, didn't mince words: "Catherine, crown in waiting." The shift in public narrative was swift, unapologetic, and merciless. Suddenly, Camilla wasn't just the queen left in the shadows. She was the one losing grip on everything she had fought to claim. Allies grew silent. Staff avoided eye contact. Even longtime friends within the firm began shifting toward neutrality. The monarchy, always careful to maintain balance, had tipped. And Catherine, once seen as the future consort, was now being whispered about in the halls of power with a new title, one not yet worn, but already earned. Yet amidst the palace chaos, Catherine herself was questioning everything. Was she truly ready to carry this weight? She didn't ask for this moment, but it found her, and when she looked into the mirror that night, she broke. The palace had gone quiet, but Catherine's thoughts raged louder than ever. After the toasts, the glances, and the storm of whispers, she returned home with a stillness that masked everything building inside her. William said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply wrapped his arms around her the moment they stepped inside. For a long time, she stayed there motionless, wordless, as the silence swallowed them both. But when she finally pulled away and met his eyes, the question escaped before she could stop it. "What if I'm not enough?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight behind it could crush kingdoms. William cupped her face, steadying her trembling breath. "This was always your path," he said, with the calm of someone who had seen it long before she had. "You just didn't see it." But that reassurance, though tender, couldn't silence the storm inside her. Because behind the glamour of titles and public admiration lived an unbearable pressure. The fear of failing not just a role, but a legacy. She thought of her children, sleeping just down the hall. Innocent, unaware, and yet completely entwined in everything that had happened. They weren't just her heart anymore. They were her anchor to the world, and the reminder of what this crown, this future, would demand of her. It was then that a quiet knock broke the tension. Anne stepped in, composed, regal, but more human in that moment than ever before. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she walked to Catherine, laid a single hand on her shoulder, and said what no one else had dared to say aloud. "You're stronger than all of us." Not a compliment, a declaration, one woman to another, one royal to the next. Catherine didn't respond, but her eyes filled again, the dam of stoicism finally cracking. Later that night, when the palace had settled and even the moon seemed to hold its breath, Catherine sat alone and finally reached for the leather folio Charles had placed under her seat. The weight of it was heavier now because she knew what it symbolized. As she broke the seal and unfolded the parchment inside, the truth sank in deeper than any speech could have conveyed. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration of trust, power, and future. She read it once, then again, and by the third time, her tears flowed freely, not out of fear, but out of the terrifying clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. The woman who had once been quietly admired for her grace was now expected to command with presence. The girl who had married into a family of tradition was now the one destined to reshape it. And the mother who had fought so hard to protect her family's peace was now at the heart of the very storm that could either uphold or unravel the monarchy. There was no turning back, not anymore. And the next morning, as the press surrounded the palace gates, she emerged with a new fire in her eyes and a royal future in her hands. She wasn't born into power, but power found her. And now, the entire world is watching her next move. As dawn broke over Westminster, the monarchy itself felt different. Not by law, not by coronation, but by something far more powerful: consent. Catherine, who had once been dismissed as a commoner with grace, now arrived beside the king not as an accessory to the throne, but as the quiet force inheriting its weight. When she stepped through the doors of Parliament beside Charles, dressed not in regalia but in resolve, the hush that fell across the room spoke louder than any formal address. There was no applause, no grand introduction. Yet every glance, every breath, every headline already knew what this moment meant: a formal beginning of the end for one era and the undeniable birth of another. Within hours, the press exploded in a storm of symbolism. Comparisons flew like wildfire, some drawing lines to the Queen Mother's stoicism, others evoking Diana's compassion. But none could escape the singular truth that had gripped the nation. Catherine had emerged not just as the people's princess, but as the monarchy's next cornerstone. Analysts debated what this meant for succession. Pundits speculated on timelines. But behind the noise, inside the palace, another quiet shift was underway. Camilla, whose absence from Parliament was initially chalked up to illness, soon confirmed her decision to step back from public duties. There was no statement, only a cryptic message released by her office: "Every queen knows when her time has passed." It wasn't an admission, it was a retreat. And then came the king's own proclamation, carefully crafted but impossible to ignore. Released through the palace's official channels, it read, "A new era begins with her." No names, no qualifications. Just 6 words that carved a fault line through centuries of rigid hierarchy. It wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. It was Charles handing the emotional weight of the monarchy to Catherine, not by law, but by will. The following day, in what appeared to be an unassuming engagement, Catherine visited a children's hospital on London's outskirts. But nothing about it was ordinary. Cameras captured the moments not because of what she wore or said, but because of how she moved through the space. Holding hands, crouching to speak with children eye to eye, offering comfort not from above, but from beside. The footage didn't need commentary. The people saw it for what it was. Not a visit, a signal. A queen not in name, but in essence. Public sentiment turned swiftly. Polls soared. Support for Catherine's role as a future monarch eclipsed even Charles himself. In pubs, on radio shows, across social media, one phrase kept surfacing: "She's already leading." It was no longer a question of if, but when. And though the crown may rest on another's head for now, it's Catherine who holds the kingdom's future in her steady hands. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.